Good evening. My name is Jennifer Forsyth, and this is Michael Wolf. We're the conference editors for the Public Land and Resources Law Review. We'd like to welcome everyone to the 32nd Annual Public Land Law Conference. This conference is the legacy of Marjorie Hunter Brown, who was a pioneer in environmental, natural resource, Indian, and public land law. Each year, the goal of the conference is to present on a contemporary issue of national or regional importance and to provide an opportunity for professionals to come together and speak on this issue. The conference this year, which we're very excited about, is a very diverse program, and it's going to address the challenges to public lands today and the key elements needed to create a federal lands agenda for the 21st century. The keynote address tonight starts the conference, and the conference will run tomorrow, all day tomorrow, and all Wednesday morning. And it's actually taking place in the conference rooms that are just right down the hall here in the University Center. For those of you who are interested, we have a schedule of events and also registration information for the rest of the conference. And it's outside at a registration table in the hallway. You just walked by it. Mike and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Office of the President, the School of Law, the Public Policy Research Institute, Western Progress, and all of the members of the Public Land and Resources Law Review who have helped us coordinate this conference. And finally, we would like to thank everyone for attending tonight. With that, President George Dennison of the University of Montana will introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to welcome you again this evening for what has become an annual intellectual treat for the University of Montana. Thanks to the editors of the Public Land and Resources Law Review and the National Advisory Committee, the School of Law, and others. It's a great deal of pleasure for me to be able to introduce our keynote speaker this evening for the agenda, or for the conference, with the title of Federal Lands Agenda for the 21st Century, Options for the Next Administration. Now, who would have thought about such an interesting title? Such an interesting challenge, and I want to commend the editors, Kyle Nelson, our co-editors, that is, of the Kyle Nelson, Jennifer Forsyth, and Michael Wolf. Let's give them a round of applause. The faculty advisor for this from the School of Law is Ray Cross. He's with us here this evening. And Dean Ed Eck from the School of Law has always provided wonderful support for the conference. A round of applause for those two, if you would, please. Jennifer mentioned earlier the sponsors, but I think it's worth mentioning them again, if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me. The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Western Progress, the law firm of Carly Howe, Hansen, Toole, and Dietrich, Cinnabar, the Western Watersheds Project, and the Montana Bar Association. It's wonderful to have that kind of involvement in the programs offered by the university and by the School of Law. And once again, I think the conference benefits from the active sponsoring partnership with the Public Policy Research Institute and the involvement of Sarah Bates, Sean Johnson, and Matt McKinney, all of whom are here this evening. Let's thank them for their work as well. In the past, the Public Land and Resource National Advisory Board assisted the student organizers to plan the agenda and identify the speakers for the conference. But this year, they've taken that one step farther, because it's the board who played the role of preparing a report on public land policy options, which will provide the beginning point for the discussions tomorrow, starting with all of those that were mentioned, and you'll see on your program when you pick it up on the way out. The board itself includes prominent experts from around the country who are willing to give of themselves, of their time and their resources and their knowledge, and who bring a diverse array of perspectives on natural resource, environmental, and Native American issues. 4 of the board members are with us here this evening. I'd like to identify them and ask them to stand, and if you'll hold your applause, we can recognize them as a group. Professor Ray Cross, Rebecca Watson, Bob Kyler, and Steve Doherty. Can we recognize this group, please? So this year, as you know, the conference focuses on options for a new presidential administration to address key issues in the public land management. And our speaker has spent a great deal of time of his career involved in these important issues. John Leshy is the Henry D. Sutherland Distinguished Professor of Real Property Law at the University of California, Hastings College of Law. He graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School. His career has spanned a multiple of involvements, public litigation in the areas of civil rights, environmental, and natural resource law in the state and federal courts, visiting professorships in college classrooms. He can't seem to hold a job, from Harvard to Georgetown to San Diego to Western Australia, and service on commissions and advisory boards for nonprofit and governmental agencies in Indian tribes. He currently serves as a trustee of the Grand Canyon Trust, the National Heritage Institute, and Western Progress, a think tank established to advance progressive policy solutions across the Intermountain West. He has held a position as president and now serves as vice chair of the board of the Weiss Foundation, which supports land conservation activities in the Intermountain West. A widely respected scholar of public land resource law, he has published numerous articles on the topics, books on the mining law of 1872 and the Arizona Constitution, the standard federal land and resources law casebooks used throughout the country, and one of the leading casebooks on water law. Especially relevant to this year's conference, President William Jefferson Clinton appointed him in 1993 as the Solicitor General of the Department of the Interior, where he served under Secretary Bruce Babbitt until the end of the Clinton administration, the second longest tenure of any solicitor in the department's 159-year history. So we have the honor this evening at the University of Montana to host Professor Leshy for tonight's talk entitled Notes on a Progressive Public Land Policy. Those of us who had the pleasure of dinner with him this evening know very well that he has some inspiring and enlightening comments to offer, and I'm sure you will find them the same. Please join me in welcoming Professor Leshy.
Thank you very much, President Dennison and Dean Eck. And I want to add my congratulations and thanks to everybody who organized this, especially Mike Wolf and Jennifer Forsyth, who I think did the yeoman work putting together what promises to be a really wonderful conference. I'm glad to see many friends here, some old, some new. I hope they're still friends after I talk. It's always great to have a conference, such a conference in Big Sky Country, and really especially appropriate to do so right now. While the rest of the country, or well, I guess all of us are caught up in the final throes of a historic election season. Seems like it's gone on forever, right? It's got another, 45 days to go. We've gathered here to work to chart a possible course for what follows. Our particular subject is one that transcends fickle blue states and red states and purple states. It's the 1/3 of the nation, which for the most part preceded the states themselves, and which stands as an ongoing reminder of the original condition of America, and that's our publicly owned landscapes. Call me an optimist, but I think we've actually come a long way on public land policy discussions since about 30 years ago, when I think I spoke at the second or third one of these public land and resources law review conferences here in Missoula, about 1979 or 80, as I recall. The topic was wilderness preservation. An issue that at that time was helping to fuel the Sagebrush Rebellion. Some of you may remember that. That was when western states like Montana were seeking to snatch title to the federal lands, or some of them away from the federal government. Ronald Reagan declared himself a sagebrush rebel during the 1980 campaign. When he won, he promptly installed James Watt as Secretary of the Interior. Some of you may remember him. Watt was a fellow who, after a day or two on the Colorado River rafting through the Grand Canyon, pronounced himself bored and ordered a helicopter to fly himself out. That revelation, by the way, motivated Mo Udall, one of the great politicians of the last half century, then chairman of the House Resources Committee, to quip that Watt's definition of wilderness was a parking lot without stripes. Bernard DeVoto, one of the great Western historians, wrote that once that only, talking about the West, that only lovers can be sound critics. That's especially true, I think, of the federal lands, public lands, and the institution that manages most of them, the Department of the Interior. As President Dennison mentioned, I worked at Interior for nearly a dozen years in the Carter administration and then back in the Clinton administration. I've always felt a great deal of affection for the place, as much as one can feel affection for a large, complicated bureaucracy as it grapples with the complex problems of managing public land. So perhaps I can play a little bit of a role of a sound critic here. The very name Interior is a little opaque, considering that what Interior does is the great outdoors, but it was glued together in 1849. This history is pretty interesting. It was a shotgun marriage between the General Land Office, which was doing a, quote, land office business, giving away the public lands. That's where that expression comes from. And the War Department's Indian Bureau. And that bureau set out to pacify and civilize the Indians. Or as one very early BIA commissioner said without any irony, our job is to make the Indian feel at home in America. Some not-so-loving critics opposed this marriage from the start. Conservative South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, anticipating future generations of Westerners, argued on the Senate floor that the creation of the Interior Department was ominous and monstrous and threatened to absorb the remaining powers of the states and swallow up everything on the face of God's earth. He actually had a point. The department's official history is called the Department of Everything Else. It was at one time the home of the Patent Office, the Pension Office, the Census. It built the D.C. District of Columbia water system, managed the District of Columbia jail, managed the hospital for the criminally insane in the district, dealt with affairs of territories like Guam and the Philippines, and on and on. It was sometimes called in its early days a slop bucket for executive fragments. And illustrious people worked there besides the prominent secretaries. John Wesley Powell, of course, Bob Marshall, whose name is on a big wilderness area north of here. Walt Whitman worked there. Rachel Carson worked there. Wallace Stegner worked there. And then some not so illustrious, Albert Bacon Fall, the first cabinet officer in American history to go to jail for crimes committed while in office, the Teapot Dome scandal. And then he's apparently got his modern counterparts in the Minerals Management Service, who apparently traded cocaine and sex for oil, as far as we can figure out. People come and go, institutions change, but the land itself abides, which brings us back to the conference subject and Interior's foremost business, which is America's federal lands. I've called my remarks notes on a progressive public lands policy. They're notes because this is not a really tightly organized brief. It's a somewhat loose collection of observations that are drawn from and to some extent reflect upon a excellent public policy report, which the conference attendees will see. It's also on the website, prepared by the Public Policy Research Center and Western Progress for this conference. And I hope to take a look at it. It's really got some interesting and provocative ideas in it. I choose the adjective progressive deliberately. Many of you are familiar with the progressive movement that flowered across America around the turn of the 20th century. I want to talk about that a little bit here because my main point is that I think it offers some strong parallels and maybe some lessons for the challenges that we face today. The old progressive movement, I'll call it the old progressive movement, a century ago, grew in reaction to rampant, unregulated corporate excess. Sound familiar? Opulent self-indulgence by the very rich in the decades after the Civil War. What Mark Twain labeled the Gilded Age was when robber barons were making vast fortunes, shamelessly promoting narrow self-interest and plundering the public trust. It was an era when William Clark, later senator from Montana, Anaconda, argued to the Constitutional Convention in Montana in 1889 when he was arguing that the capital ought to be in Butte. Somebody said, what about the smoke from the smelter? And he said, it's a healthy disinfectant, pleasing ladies with just enough arsenic to give them a beautiful complexion. I'm not making this up, actually. It was an era when Elbert Gary was the head of U.S. Steel. He required his workers to put in 12-hour days, 7 days weeks, and 24-hour shift every 2 weeks, while he and the other owners reaped fabulous profits. It was said of Gary that he never saw a blast furnace until after he died. He actually probably anticipated that because his coffin was apparently made of such high-quality steel that it took 15 university-strapping football players to carry it. And it was an era of yellow journalism, with a press captive to political agendas, sensationalism, and scandal-mongering with only passing interest in the facts. It was an era of unrestrained exploitation of public lands and natural resources. Against this low point in civic virtue rose up a bipartisan movement. Bipartisan, underscore that. The progressives. Their cause was helped, their rise was helped, interestingly enough, by financial panics around the turn of the 20th century, fueled by unregulated speculators on Wall Street that threw the country twice into deep depressions. They preached, among other things, that government should keep key natural resources in public ownership and manage them to serve the broad public interest. And government should do so through innovative public-private partnerships guided by the teachings of science. The movement's champion, as most of you know, was the irrepressible Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt struck fear in the hearts of the robber barons. Their Karl Rove-like strategist Mark Hanna seethed at him, called him that damn cowboy when he became president. Unlike latter-day corporate cowboys, however, TR didn't say greed is good and government is bad. He said things like greed ought to have limits. And government, when properly guided, can be a powerful source for social good. TR made conservation of natural resources a centerpiece of the progressive movement. As he put it, this was the, quote, fundamental problem, for unless we solve that problem, it will avail us little to solve the others. He criticized, and I quote, the short-sighted men who in their greed and selfishness will, if permitted, rob our country of half its charm by their reckless extermination of all useful and beautiful wild things. He noted that the robber barons and their defenders justified their plunder by arguing that these resources belong to the people. He agreed, but he added a crucial qualification, saying, and I quote, not merely the people now alive, but the unborn people. TR and the other progressives said the object of their movement should be to provide the greatest good for the greatest number, but that number, he said, embraces those within the womb of time, compared to which those now alive form but an insignificant fraction. Our duty to the whole, including the unborn generations, bids us restrain an unprincipled present-day minority from wasting the heritage of these unborn generations. The movement for the conservation of all our natural resources, he said, is essentially democratic in spirit, purpose, and method. Building on this platform, the progressives profoundly transformed this country. We enjoy the fruits of their labors every day in ways we often take for granted. They permanently preserved large tracts of federally owned land in America's world-renowned systems of national parks, national forests, national wildlife refuges. They installed reforms so that public resources like fossil fuels and the hydropower sites were no longer given away willy-nilly to the private sector, but instead were leased to private interests for development under the watchful eye of government control. If that movement had not occurred, I dare say the quality of life in Montana and in the West would be far different, and I would argue it would be far diminished. So why highlight this history? Well, it seems to me we may be seeing the end of a modern-day Gilded Age. It's a second era in which Wall Street moguls have pronounced that corporate greed is good, and the interests of the larger community, well, not so much. An era in which the government has been demonized as an obstacle, bungling or incompetent at best, and downright evil at worst. An era in which one Secretary of the Interior's reaction to news of a dangerous hole in the Earth's ozone layer was not to address the man-made cause of the problem, but to advise people to wear sunglasses and hats. An era in which a vice president of the United States said conservation may be a sign of personal virtue, but it's not a basis for a sound energy policy. An era where national leaders chose to ignore an emerging scientific consensus on the threat of global climate change and refused for many years to address its causes or grapple with its effects. Now, some fatalists say history moves in cycles. To me, that deterministic view kind of ignores our creative will. From another corner, cynics say we study history so we can recognize our mistakes once we make them again. That jaundiced view, I think, overlooks America's innate optimism. It's interesting that beneath the noisy partisan rhetoric of this presidential campaign, both candidates have invoked the bipartisan spirit of Teddy Roosevelt. If we listen carefully, I think we can hear modern echoes of that historic transition from the Gilded Age to the progressive movement that took place roughly a century ago. And we are reminded why the West is more than the place where this election might be won or lost, because it may be here where America rediscovers the best within itself and remains, in the famous words of Wallace Stegner, the geography of hope. Now, whatever happens, I will not expect Westerners will rush fully into the embrace of the federal government. For although I think most Westerners love their public lands, they also love freedom and privacy and carry in their hearts a streak of libertarianism that bridles at government interference with their personal lives. Nor should they rush to put all their faith in government. Government is like us. Government is us. It's capable of bad and stupid things, but it is our instrument and it can be used to do good and wise things if we choose to use it that way. There are no atheists in foxholes, the old saying goes. I was reminded that saying over the weekend as we observed former fierce advocates of deregulation do an abrupt reversal in a crisis and look to the government to fix the collapse of the unregulated financial markets. Here in the West, we can appreciate that irony, for here we've long embodied a great harmonious paradox, a culture that prizes rugged independence, yet flourishes amid a vast public domain managed mostly by a government based thousands of miles away. Now, with that past as perhaps our prologue, let me offer a few notes on what might be a new progressive era in public land policy. TR's progressives spoke, as I quoted him, of their obligation to those yet unborn. That includes us. Our obligation to future generations in turn, and the foremost challenge of our age, is to control carbon emissions, to keep greenhouse gases within tolerable bounds. We humans have long operated under the paradigm that the future climate will always generally be like the past. But today we're in the midst of a massive shift in that paradigm. That shift will demand rapid responses to both the causes and the consequences of climate change. Our federal lands must play a part, a really important part, as we try to, as someone once wrote quite eloquently, as we try to avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. Climate change can change everything, sometimes in ways we can't even yet imagine. With its shadow hovering over us, let me address some of the policy challenges that run through the federal lands today. Let's start with energy policy. Energy is the biggest producer of carbon emissions. The federal lands are the biggest single supplier of carbon-intensive fuels in the United States. 2/5 of our natural gas, 1/3 of our crude oil, and half of our coal. There's no doubt we need a new energy policy. But there's also no doubt that the federal lands will remain an important source of fossil fuels to bridge the transition to it. New progressives cannot ignore that reality. That does not mean the federal government should continue to be handed over to the oil industry by overriding concerns of state and local governments, ranchers, hunters, anglers, and everyone else in its relentless drive to make traditional fossil fuel energy production the dominant use of federal lands. New progressives, like their predecessors a century ago, should affirm that our public resources are not industry's private domain. The federal government should work closely with all affected stakeholders to confine fossil fuel development to areas of highest yield potential and lowest conflicts with other values, and to tighten regulations to make sure industries clean up and reclaim their own waste. Moving to a post-carbon future, federal lands will likely be much in demand as sites for solar, wind, geothermal, and associated energy transmission infrastructure. It'll also be in demand for sites for geological sequestration of carbon, physically forcing CO2 underground, hopefully forever. and sites for biologically growing biomass to capture carbon on the surface through restoring forests and grasslands. And groundwater aquifers under public land will likely be in demand as well to cushion against drought cycles. Through such means, all told, the federal lands need to become a vast demonstration project for how we manage natural resources in a carbon-conscious world. It's a big challenge. TR's progressives were bold in thinking about new ways to do things. Modern progressives are going to need to be bold as well and craft innovative policies for siting solar, wind, groundwater storage and recovery and carbon sequestration projects, and rights of way for transmission lines and pipelines so that supply can efficiently meet demand, while still serving other needs and protecting those landscapes so important to the Western quality of life. Through such efforts, the public lands can play an important role in the vital task of reducing carbon emissions so that we can avoid the unmanageable. But new progressives must also figure out ways to manage the unavoidable. And that means using federal lands to mitigate the consequences of climate change already underway. Even before what humans were doing to the climate became appreciated, the rich variety of life on Earth was shrinking at an alarming rate. The implications of this are profound for the economy, human health, and ethics, as well as ecology. Climate change will probably accelerate this loss by altering habitats and changing the timing of seasonal events such as snowmelt and insect emergence. The federal lands could be ever more crucial biodiversity reservoirs, sanctuaries for species imperiled by shifting habitats and other climatic changes. It is, as Joseph Wood Crouch wrote more than a half a century ago, not a sentimental fact, not a sentimental but a grimly literal fact, that unless we share the planet with creatures other than ourselves, we shall not be able to live on it for long. More broadly, the federal lands will become more and more prized for their value in providing what have come to be known as ecosystem services, the myriad of ways in which the natural world helps protect the quality of human life here on Earth. The four cornerstones for a progressive federal land policy, I think, should be to restore the promise of the three great national land systems created by the first progressive movement: national forests, national parks, and national wildlife refuges, and to nourish and expand a fourth such system, a fledgling one, the Bureau of Land Management's National Landscape Conservation System. Now, the National Forest System has fallen on hard times. We all know that. Its budget is, half of its budget is now consumed by firefighting. Its planning and decision-making process is in somewhat of a shambles. Communities once depended upon their share of revenue from timber sales are facing cutbacks. It needs a close and systematic look. National Park System has also suffered, despite its iconic stature and its overwhelming popularity. President Bush, like many predecessors, took office promising full funding for the system, but his administration never came close to achieving that goal. The administration has announced an ambitious centennial initiative that is a 10-year revitalization program to end with the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service in 2016, calling for $1 billion in new federal funds appropriated at a rate of $100 million per year and $2 billion in private money. Today's progressives should embrace that centennial initiative, but some really hard thinking needs to be done about the role of national parks in a climate-changed world and about the appropriate criteria for expanding the system, what the system should do in urbanized areas, the role of public-private partnerships in the parks, and how best to assess and meet deferred maintenance needs. The National Wildlife Refuge System, less well known, has also been somewhat starved. It covers an area the size of California, 550 units scattered throughout all the 50 states, gets 40 million visitors a year. But it faces the particular challenges of adapting to a destabilized climate because many of its habitats are vulnerable, coastal wetlands, barrier islands, and other vulnerable habitats. So we need similar hard thinking about how to chart its future, especially including ways to make its funding base more secure and robust. And what about the largest federal lands agency of all, the Bureau of Land Management? Values change with time. Long after the states and the railroads and the miners and the homesteaders and the ranchers and others had picked through the federal public domain, BLM and others recognized that its 260 million acres, including 8 million acres in Montana, contain some superb scenic, historic, cultural, and recreational landscapes. Like their counterparts in the other three great systems, these landscapes provide ecosystem services, some great habitat, great cultural resources, inspiration, education, outdoor scientific laboratories, not to mention tourism dollars for local economies. Yet barely 10% of the BLM lands have been protected as national conservation areas or national monuments or wilderness. To address this problem, the Clinton administration created the new National Landscape Conservation System within BLM for these specially designated land. While some of the Clinton-Babbitt moves were initially controversial in more conservative parts of the West, they and the NLCS have rather quickly gained acceptance, even demand for more. In fact, the Bush administration has endorsed a proposal now pending in Congress to give the NLCS statutory recognition and permanence, which will allow it to grow and mature to rival TR's, Teddy Roosevelt's progressive-era counterparts. The NLCS's major unfinished business on the federal lands. There's no doubt the BLM contains other magnificent areas worthy of inclusion in it. Today's progressives should work to nurture and expand it so it can take its rightful place as the new progressive counterpart to these three earlier great systems. Charting the future of the federal lands in a climate change world requires another policy initiative also mentioned in the background paper prepared by the Public Policy Research Institute, namely rationalizing federal land ownership to better meet today's challenges. Now, this is a little complicated, but bear with me. In reaction to America's early history of sort of fast and furious and sometimes careless land disposal, the turn of the 20th century of progressive movement, the earlier one, not only decided to keep hundreds of millions of acres of federal land permanently in federal ownership, but also inaugurated the first significant program of acquiring more lands back into public ownership. This program, started in 1911 with the Weeks Act, was responsible for all the national forests that we now find in the East and the Midwest. They were all acquired. For most national parks outside the West, and for national wildlife refuges across the country. This acquisition program, not that well known, has continued. Now more than ever, it has an emphasis on protecting habitat and connectivity and biodiversity. Federal lands can serve and should serve as important reservoirs and refugia for biodiversity, but only if we protect and in some cases restore the kind of connective tissue of migratory corridors that allow nature to adapt to the changes that seem to be underway. Many of you are familiar with, I think, the largest single such effort in this country, for it's in your backyard. I'm referring to the Montana Legacy Project's proposed acquisition using federal, state, and donated private funds to acquire 320,000 acres of Plum Creek lands, the checkerboarded lands with the federal lands, the legacy of the Northern Pacific Railroad grant, in order to restore their ecological integrity. To its great credit, the state of Montana is not only a key player in that effort, but is also pursuing other acquisitions for the state, such as I just recently read about, acquiring the Lincoln Ranch, 11 miles of riparian habitat on the Marias River. As this shows, the federal government has no monopoly on these kinds of initiatives. In this sort of effort to reconfigure federal lands, lands managed by the BLM need particular scrutiny. A considerable amount of BLM land is shot through with inholdings. It's held in scattered, difficult to manage parcels with some value for development, but not much ecological value. Just as Rachel Carson did not oppose all pesticides, only their indiscriminate excessive use, so it's no heresy to say, or should be no heresy to say, that not every acre of the vast federal domain has to stay in public ownership. Make no mistake, not talking about the Sagebrush Rebellion. That Sagebrush Rebellion, with its sort of careless calls for large-scale divestiture of federal lands, is dead. I think its last gasp came about 3 years ago when the ill-advised so-called Pombo-Gibbons mining law reform tried to indiscriminately privatize several millions of acres of federal land. It actually passed the House, but then died in the Senate in early 2006. I think the final nail in the Sagebrush Rebellion coffin came 2 years ago when voters in California evicted House Resource Committee Chairman Richard Pombo from office. He was sort of the leader of that group. We are moving, I think, beyond, and have moved beyond such simplistic kind of blunderbuss approaches to federal lands. The essential question is not quantitative. It's not how many acres the federal government owns. It's qualitative. Where should these lands be? What attributes and characteristics should they have, and what values should they serve? Much can be done to harmonize the patchwork of land holdings, such as by selling nature-poor scattered areas and use the proceeds to consolidate and enhance integrated habitat. Now, none of these initiatives, and others like it, are going to be possible without a renewed civic will and a renewed interest and pride in our public lands. We need to promote more extensive citizen engagement in these matters. Go back to Teddy Roosevelt. He was a fierce and famous proponent of what he called the strenuous life, which for him was getting outside, on the land, hunting, fishing, viewing wildlife, hiking, camping, with his trademark incredible energy. Today's progressives need to aggressively promote that outlook by advocating environmental education, a conservation ethic, volunteerism on the public lands. Teddy Roosevelt spoke of how what he called a prophylactic dose of nature could bring more balance to modern life and inculcate a conservation ethic. Sounds silly? Well, it actually turns out TR was right. An unsettling syndrome called nature deficit disorder is prevalent among the nation's youth. And I'm not making this up, and I commend a book to you called Last Child in the Woods. Many of you may have already read it. This syndrome has pernicious health, educational, cultural, and political effects. We need to combat it. The senses are powerful. Nature offers the opposite reality from one that is virtual, and it's virtual reality that seems to capture too many of our kids. Wildlands leave a lasting imprint on our psyche and on our character. But it's very hard to mobilize popular support for something if people never get to experience it even a little. Federal lands are within easy driving distance of an overwhelming majority of Americans and offers outstanding opportunities for a stimulating experience and encounter with nature. Combating nature deficit disorder is or ought to be a bipartisan national cause, and the federal land should play an essential role in that. It is heartening to see that both presidential candidates are speaking on the stump meaningfully about national service. No matter who wins the election, new progressive programs should be instituted or expanded to promote volunteerism on the federal lands, environmental education, things like senior citizens helping out in visitor centers, volunteer crews doing trail maintenance and cleanup, students and others helping with surveys of wildlife and cultural and historic resources and that sort of thing. Very important. Also, none of the initiatives I've talked about is possible without more money and more prudent fiscal management. And here, of course, is the problem. A basic rule of politics is, of course, follow the money, or as the Californian Jesse Unruh once put it, money is the mother's milk of politics. So new progressives have to pay close attention to budgetary issues, particularly as we are seeing surpluses turning into budget deficits as far as the eye can see. And I think this week the budget deficit just expanded by $1 trillion. Hard to believe. The object needs to be to put management of federal lands and related programs on a fiscally sound basis. Now, federal policy on these fiscal budgetary matters is really an incoherent hodgepodge. And I'm not just talking about the Minerals Management Service and the scandals there. I'm talking about the policies, because the policies have evolved very haphazardly over the years. Hard rock miners pay no rental, no royalty at all for using federal lands. Other users of federal lands pay much less than their counterparts if they were on state land or private land for comparable uses. As many of you know, in recent years, federal agencies have been much more aggressive about charging fees for camping and recreational uses, creating controversy and proposals for legislative reform. And then to add to all this kind of confusion and incoherence, the money the feds take in goes off in all kinds of different directions. Some goes directly into the federal treasury to be appropriated out for other uses or fight the deficit or whatever. Others are earmarked for conservation, but often get diverted en route. Still others stay put in true revolving funds where, for example, recreation fees can be reinvested by local managers. But there is no rhyme or reason or clear or consistent rationale to any of this. And that's really what we need. We need clear and consistent rationales, and we need firm enforcement to do things like clean up the mess at MMS. Very important to restore public confidence in the management of these publicly owned resources, because that public confidence is fragile and we need it if we are to make progress. I think the next progressive administration, whatever it is, should convene some sort of working group or task force to comprehensively examine federal policies in this area, royalty, rental, fee policies, to compare the existing policy landscape with what states and private landowners are doing, to evaluate options and to recommend whether, where, and how much to charge federal land users. And I'm not really talking about just miners and drillers and loggers and ranchers and recreationists, because we got a whole new batch of new users coming in to play, a renewable resource energy users, wind projects, solar projects, hydro projects, geothermal projects, carbon sequestration projects, groundwater recharge and recovery projects. These are all going to come on the federal lands, and we need to figure out how we're going to handle them from not just a management standpoint, but from a fiscal standpoint. Transmission line rights-of-way, same thing. Big problem, we haven't thought enough about it, and we haven't devised yet sound policies for it. One fiscal matter worth particular mention here is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It was created in 1965, and it's supposed to receive about $1 billion a year annually from federal oil and gas royalty revenue. And the purpose of the fund is to distribute the money to federal, state, and local agencies for conservation projects and land-related recreation projects. Despite the promise, brilliant idea, it's never really been fully funded. In the current administration, Land and Water Conservation Fund appropriations have declined by 70% between 2001 and 2008. But the Land and Water Conservation Fund is actually very, very popular, and with good reason. Among other things, that pot of money, fairly modest in a multi-trillion-dollar economy, can help diffuse and resolve many natural resource conflicts through the kind of reconfiguration and acquisition initiatives I spoke of earlier. Now, I don't want to leave you with the notion that the early 20th century progressives got it all right. They didn't, actually. They made some mistakes. They were not saints, although pretty close to it in some respects, my view. They were very successful, too successful in taming fire, something many of you know something about firsthand, I expect. The effects of that, some would call today kind of calamitous. I don't need to go into the details here, but the policy of fighting fire has had real implications for wildland forest management and housing development and all sorts of things in the West. They also got some things wrong on water, but I won't go into details there because I want to leave time for questions. The lesson I draw from their mistakes, I think we can fairly call them mistakes, is twofold, I think. One is kind of an attitude. I think we need to go about a reform agenda with a little humility and guarding against hubris. There's a wonderful moment. I teach constitutional law, among other things. In the Constitutional Convention of 1787, there was a wonderful debate among the framers of the Constitution as to whether to put in the Constitution a provision that would allow it to be amended. And some people argued, it's perfect, why do we need to have an amendment process? Because we got it all right. And Ben Franklin, bless his heart, argued them out of it. And he, among other things, he said, we have to remember that we are not infallible. We need to have a sense of our own fallibility, and we are going to get things wrong, and the Constitution is probably going to need to be amended, and we need an amendment process. It's a good lesson. You're never going to get things entirely right the first time. The progressives 100 years ago were bold, experimental. They mostly succeeded, I think. But they didn't get everything right. And I think we have to remember that these times call for bold experimentation, and we're going to get some things wrong. And, compromises are going to be necessary. That's one lesson, I think, to draw from this, from their mistakes. The second lesson is that you have to respect the science. You have to invest in science. and you have to pay attention to what it teaches. That means, among other things, paying attention to a maxim that the USGS, I think, once published a book with this title. It said, "Nature to be commanded must first be obeyed." And if you think about it, that's a very powerful idea. Our mistakes in fire policy, I think, from well-intentioned from 100 years ago, stand as vivid reminders of that. So science has to play a powerful role. Well, I think the challenges facing the federal public lands, and I haven't by no means listed all of them, for the next administration, whoever is elected, are enormous. They are in some ways, I think, a kind of a slice, a microcosm of the challenges the country faces, and indeed all humanity faces. In some fundamental way, Teddy Roosevelt and the old progressives understood that connection. And so I find myself, when I put these remarks together, turning to Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives, not merely because of what they accomplished, which was amazing, but because of their faith in the power of the federal public lands to make Americans more cohesive, more tolerant, and more democratic. The old progressives believed, as Wallace Stegner so eloquently put it later, that, quote, "something would go out of us as a people if we let our last intact large landscapes be broken up, degraded, sacrificed, or liquidated." The transcending vision of Teddy Roosevelt's movement, which I believe to be shared by many Americans today, is that the federal public lands are not only shared by every American, but they shape our character and our identity. And so they can no more be converted into a collection of unrelated parts than we as citizens of these United States can be reduced to kind of a loose assembly of disaggregated people. That first progressive movement bequeathed to us the challenge of managing our federal public lands wisely. It's a heavy responsibility, this fragile and precious living gift which binds us to our ancestors and which we in turn hold in trust for those future generations yet unborn. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer questions. If any have provoked any, maybe I've lulled you into sleep. No? Hey, John?
John, one aspect of the progressive movement you haven't touched on a lot is sort of institutional reform that manifests itself in Bureau of Reclamation, Park Service,
Right.
Other institutions. What institutional reforms do you see necessary as we go forward from this time?
It's a very good question, and I actually at one point was going to put something in the talk about it. My personal experience from many years in and out of government, watching government, and working inside government, is that form does drive function to some extent. That is, where the boxes are on the chart and how government is organized does have an impact on outcomes. And from time to time, lots of different kinds of reorganizations has been proposed. Forest Service moving to Interior. That idea is actually back again. Should NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service be consolidated, or at least the endangered species parts of there? There are a lot of kind of odd jurisdictional arrangements. Should the Interior Department be organized on watershed lines? Should we put the agencies have them cooperate much more closely together in terms of natural landscape? All those kinds of things. I think they're all interesting ideas. Some of them are pretty important, but my kind of bottom line as a sort of a functionary on this stuff is they all take enormous amounts of political capital. And often, like the Forest Service to Interior, sounds really simple, but you've got some fiercely dug-in committees on Capitol Hill that will let that happen only over their dead bodies. And so the real question for an administration is, how much political capital do we want to spend on this compared to what we get for it? And I think that's the really important question. And I think most of the time, the answer is going to be it's not worth it. I remember sitting down with Bruce Babbitt before January 20th, 1993, and I was doing the transition stuff for Interior, and he had just been named secretary, and we had a talk, and he said, how about the Forest Service? Gee, we ought to make a grab for the Forest Service. And I'm exaggerating a little. He'd probably deny saying that, but hey. My word against his, I'm right. I had just read Tommy Watson's wonderful book on Harold Ickes. Now I'm blanking on the name, Righteous Pilgrim, which was a biography of Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes. It's a wonderful read if you're interested in public land politics. And that book had just come out. And the consistent theme running through the book was how Harold Ickes was just spent his entire 13 and a half years as secretary, the longest serving cabinet officer in American history, salivating over getting the Forest Service. I mean, he is like every waking moment was designed, and everything he did was designed to get persuade Franklin Roosevelt to transfer the Forest Service to Interior. And Roosevelt, FDR, was a master politician in many ways and a master manager of the bureaucracy. And every time he wanted Harold Ickes to do something, especially something, unappetizing, like go run the Public Works Administration or something, as well as be Secretary of the Interior, he'd call Ickes over to the Oval Office and say, Harold, I need you to do this Public Works thing, and I know it's a big sacrifice, it's going to take a lot of work, be a big headache and all that, but, if you can do this well, I think the Forest Service, we could probably do something about that, He must have done that, 10 times over the course of his presidency. Just dangle it out there and get Ickes to, do something, and then he'd dangle it, take it back, So, so when Babbitt brought this up, I said, read, I earmarked the pages. I said, read these pages and see how much time you can waste doing this kind of stuff. And so he came back and said, yeah, I think it's probably not worth it, So that's the problem with the big reorganizations, the big, moving the boxes. And I'm not saying don't do it. And sometimes these things happen. They have to happen at a kind of magic political moment, something that big, at least. Now, maybe, the appropriation committees recently asked the General Accounting Office to look at the idea of moving the Forest Service to the Interior Department. So the appropriators are interested in it. That's great. But, and if the agriculture committees say, yeah, we don't mind losing all that jurisdiction over the Forest Service and having it go to the Interior and Energy committees, maybe. But I wouldn't hold my breath. So bottom line is I'm not a big fan in reorganization for its own sake. If it happens, if it makes sense and there's a kind of political moment that you can bring it off, fine. But just don't do it for its own sake, and often the costs are going to outweigh the benefits. Bob?
John, there's been much discussion about reforming some of the basic laws that govern the public lands, running all the way from the general mining law that you're familiar with to NEPA, to the Endangered Species Act, and beyond. Of course, that involves Congress, and your comments were principally focused on executive action. But do you see any likely movement toward any major congressional law reform efforts in the near future, or is it necessary in your view?
Yeah, hard question to answer, without knowing the outcome of the election and what happened, what happens to the margins in Congress and who controls Congress and all of that. I would say one of the most interesting things about the Bush administration is how little they sought from Congress. Not only on public lands, but a lot of other things as well, as we know. But on public lands, I mean, they had no bills up there to speak of, other than the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. So their I think approach was, we'll do everything on our own. And it can be done in the public lands area. I mean, there's a lot of room in these laws for flexibility. I mean, we exploited it in the Clinton administration in a number of respects, Endangered Species Act and other things. So you don't necessarily need Congress. Looking ahead to the next administration, I mean, clearly the public lands agenda is going to be way, way, way down. I mean, it's foreign, it's the war, it's the terrorism, and then domestically, I mean, God, look at healthcare, the whole financial regulation stuff. I mean, the public land stuff are going to be lost in the shuffle, except for energy. I mean, the energy climate, there clearly is going to be a very serious effort next year to pass legislation. And never can tell, but it probably will pass. And that may bring some reforms with it. But I don't think that in the next 2 or 3 years, there's just going to be time and energy in Congress to do much outside the energy climate change area that is going to do major public land reform. Now, mining law might be an exception because it's already got kind of a head of steam. The House passed a good bill this year. That's all up to Harry Reid in the Senate, and I don't know what will happen there. But I'm not looking, bottom line, for a big, massive, not in the next first term, maybe a second term if all these other things get solved and under control. Now, what that suggests actually, and I've kind of hinted at this, I think, in my remarks, what that might suggest is that a good sort of public lands agenda for a kind of reform-minded administration, and it could be McCain, it could be Obama, is to spend the first term or the first 2 or 3 years trying to study these issues, find a consensus, find a sweet spot that you could then, get something enacted in year 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 if you're lucky enough to get a second term. But I just don't see early on there's going to be too much else, much higher priority crowding out significant congressional attention on this. Yeah.
Yes, I think I can speak loudly enough without the microphone. Thank you, John, for a really remarkable talk. I'm curious about one thing, though. I was pleased to hear you talk about and offer the praises of science. And yet, if science has taught us anything, it's that everything's connected to everything else. And I'm wondering, is there a role for public institutions to address private lands as well? I know this is a public lands law review conference, but isn't there a connection there that we have to address somehow with public sector institutions?
Oh, sure. There's a lot of science that public institutions can do that's relevant to public land and private land management. This whole idea of reconfiguring, do we own the right lands in public ownership to meet the needs that we're going to have to be met with climate change and that sort of thing? These kind of basic ecological studies and conservation biology and all that kind of stuff has a lot to say, not only to public landowners, but to private landowners, and how to marry the two, or how to reorient the two. So I think there's an enormous role for science. Now, I will say this, and the science of conservation biology is the big science here when we're talking about large tracts of land and protecting habitat and biodiversity. And it's a new, relatively young science, and it's a science. I think it's E.O. Wilson who said it's a science, a discipline with a deadline. It's sort of working against time. It's also a lot of loose judgment. It's not like doing physics in the laboratory or something, and so it's difficult. And that's why we have things like adaptive management, where you sort of try stuff and see if it works, and if it doesn't work, try to adapt it to make it work better. That is sort of easy to describe, but it's terribly difficult to do on the ground, particularly when you got a lot of public land users out there who want answers and don't want, who want commitments and who want crisp understanding of what the rules are, because the whole idea of adaptive management is we kind of make up the rules as we go along to some extent. So it's a difficult, challenging science to work with, but they're absolutely essential, not to sort of tell you what you must do, but really to tell you what your parameters are. I've been involved in, hundreds, thousands of sort of decisions about natural resource management, and almost never does science actually say you got to do this. What science, it doesn't answer the questions, but it really does tell you what your options are and how wide your parameters are. But it's almost always some judgment is involved in these natural resource management things. But the role of, now science has suffered. Public institutions, government science has really suffered in terms of funding and that sort of thing. And that's a real problem, I think, and something that has to be addressed. But, in a dollar-short world, I'm not sure how we can do that easily. But educational institutions are really important on this kind of stuff. Here.
Any more questions?
Yeah, we got a couple more.
Okay.
Water and public lands are tied together. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Water and public lands. Yeah, I left it pretty much out of my talk. I was going to put something in at one point, and I thought, well, it's such a large subject once you open it up. Water and public lands. I'm actually pretty optimistic about water in one sense. I am pretty pessimistic about the future of the hydrograph, as it were. I mean, I think in a lot of areas in the West, and everything we know about the emerging science of climate change, and we don't know very much about what's going to happen in particular areas, but we know, the models are pretty good now in sort of big picture trends, and they're not happy, they're not pretty. Southwest in particular, Southeast to some extent, Colorado River Basin. We're looking at some pretty dramatic changes. Snowpack in California. Snowpack in California is a huge natural water supply. And it's going to be substantially gone maybe in the next 50 years. So those kind of trends are quite scary. Now, I'm optimistic in, despite that kind of stark potential future, because I think in the last 3 or 4 years, the professional water managers have been getting it. I think they're talking to these scientists. These are sophisticated people, the urban water people, to some extent the rural, the irrigation district people, the larger ones, with some who can afford to get this kind of advice, are looking at these trends and going, wow, we are scared to death. We really need to do something. Now, the good news is, two pieces of good news. One is, I think there's a huge consciousness shift that's gone on, and consciousness of this problem and the dimensions of it and the need to do something pretty drastic. The other good news is there's actually, in most areas, a good deal of water and a lot of pretty innovative, creative things that can be done to deal with shortages. Little things like Montana does this a fair amount. I think John wrote the law on leasing, and leasing water, short-term or long-term. So you're not giving up your water rights, but you're helping the cities fallowing crops. Los Angeles is doing a lot of this now. A lot of conservation stuff that really makes a lot of sense. Las Vegas has really done some pretty amazing things here. A lot of innovative groundwater, surface water, groundwater recharge. All states now have laws on this, and there are recharge projects all over the place. So there really is a lot of. There's been a kind of a. For 30 years, people have been sort of saying, "Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that?" There are a lot of these good things you can do to make water, last longer, use it more effectively, and all of that. Now we have the reason. Now we have the excuse, and now we have water managers who are willing to go to that toolbox and start using these tools. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that we're not going to have this kind of huge crisis. Now, that depends on, what happens to the climate in the long term. But look at what happened in the Colorado River last year. The agreement the 7 basin states reached with a little prodding, but not frankly all that much, from the federal government. The 7 basin states sat down and cut a deal on how to make the basin management much more flexible in various complicated ways we don't need to get into here. But I think it was the largest single most significant change in the law of the Colorado River since 1922. And they did it after 6 months of hard negotiation, but all driven by this need that, wow, we really got a problem that we need to address. And the funny thing about water is, everybody a lot of people predict that, the next war is going to be fought over water and all that. If you look at the history of water, often when you have the real crisis, people figure out ways to get through it. Massive drought in California in 1977. People conserved like hell, and they did a lot. They ran a pipeline across the Richmond Bridge to take water to Marin and stuff like that. But they got through it. So there's a lot of that remains to be done. It'll be a change in certain, many important respects, but I'm actually pretty optimistic. Now, federal lands, water on federal lands in particular, federal lands produce most of the water in the West. That's the high elevation, that's where the snowpack is, by and large, on federal lands. That's where most of the precipitation comes. And that suggests that the more we do to conserve those landscapes or restore them to make them better water manager, or, better water storers and the like, is important. So I think it'll add some oomph to the whole restoration conservation movement, because water and federal lands are so inextricably related, and federal lands are really responsible for much of the water that we have and use here.
Do you have any thoughts about how roads management affects the management of federal lands and the policy issues that you've been discussing?
Roads, R-O-A-D-S? Big. The Forest Service is, what do they say? It's the largest road manager in the universe, or something like that. It's got 600,000 miles or something of roads. Been a lot of interesting stuff done about roads. If you like that subject, actually, there's a book that was co-authored by a guy I got to know a couple of years ago, Richard Foreman. It's called Road Ecology. It's actually a collection of essays about the ecological impact of roads from everything, erosion, wildlife, etc. We're not going to build many more roads, probably, unless, depending on the energy stuff, on federal lands. I mean, I think, depends on how much is used for solar and wind and stuff, because you need access to those things, obviously. Roads are a big impact, can be a big impact in terms of wildlife migration patterns. Wildlife migration patterns might change because of climate change. Roads are significant sources of erosion and can affect water quality, and that might impact species and biodiversity. So roads can be a big issue and a big problem. Forest Service, I think, is putting a number of roads to bed, kind of trying to reduce the size of its network. So it's a big management issue in many areas. I don't think new road building is going to be that much of a problem unless the energy move to renewables and stuff puts more pressure in that direction. But is that enough? Do you have a particular
one thing
observation?
We've been facing here in Montana particularly is the opening of Plum Creek roads to residential development.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a very interesting legal issue. We were actually talking about that at dinner. The scope of the easement. I teach property law too, and that's a classic property exam question, bar exam. The scope of the easement. Well, that's exactly what's going on there. Although the process by which this was negotiated, I know is controversial, and I'm not going to get into that. Not familiar with the details, but that's a somewhat. That's an important issue. And it gets back to something I did talk about, which is the reconfiguration issue. These issues come up because these lands often are configured awkwardly. A checkerboard. As Jack Ward Thomas, the former chief of the Forest Service, used to say, the guy who designed the checkerboard system of land patterns disposal ought to be shot, because it's just terribly awkward, especially if you're trying to manage for, large landscape conservation. And this Plum Creek Forest Service, easement problem through the checkerboard is a classic example of that awkward management. Now, in some places, including some big ones here in Montana, you can solve those problems by exchange. Block up lands. Done a lot of that in Arizona, done a fair amount in Montana and some other places. More of that needs to happen, actually. The checkerboard pattern is really a nightmare. If you look at a detailed land ownership map of the West, you see those railroad land grants. You know exactly where they are because the checkerboards are still there in many places. And exchange is a good way to do it. They're difficult to negotiate, but they can be done. And I see more of that. The original purpose for the checkerboard was actually, amazingly enough, a kind of, it was because of a constitutional problem. The conservatives in the early 19th century said the federal government had no authority to promote internal improvements like railroads. That was only a state function. But there was a tremendous public pressure to give away federal lands to subsidize railroad construction. And so to combat the conservatives' argument that you didn't have authority to do this, somebody in the 1840 came up with the idea of let's give away land to the railroads in a checkerboard, and that will have this effect. It will enhance the value of the federal lands that are retained. And therefore, the government is not subsidizing the railroads and internal improvements, but it's actually just improving the value of its own lands. So through that bizarre kind of, beginning, we now end up with, 50 million acres of checkerboarded land that just doesn't suit modern, management imperatives. But it's one of the many ways that kind of history has left its tentacles in modern public lands. So.
Let's thank Mr. Leshy one more time.
Just want to remind everyone Thank you.